Welcome back to Real Crime Stories. Now, let's begin today's story. One afternoon, years after Jodi Parrack's death, an investigator sat across from a man named Ray Macan and told him two very specific things. That his DNA had been found on the body of an 11-year-old girl, and that a security camera had captured him lying about where he'd been on the night she disappeared. Neither of these things was true, not even close. But Macan didn't know that yet. He only knew that someone was telling him in a certain tone of science that he had killed a child. And for years afterward, almost no one else knew the truth was any different from what he just heard. This is the story of a case that was solved wrong once, before it was solved right 8 years later than it should have been. And when the truth finally arrived, it wouldn't come from anyone sitting in that interrogation room. It would come from somewhere no one in this investigation ever thought to look. To understand how a single lie could carry that much weight, enough to hold a man for years, we have to go back to an ordinary afternoon, in a town where almost everyone knew everyone's name. Constantine is a small town in the southwest corner of Michigan, just a few miles from the Indiana state line. Fewer than 2,000 people live there. It's the kind of town where most people grow up together, attend the same high school, play on the same youth teams, and decades later, still eat breakfast at the same diner. Where every face is a familiar one, and every rumor travels faster than any newspaper. Before 2007, Constantine hadn't seen a single murder in 30 years. That kind of peace is the kind you only recognize once it's gone. Jodi Christine Parrack was born on September 2nd, 1996. By the fall of 2007, she was 11 years old, a 5th grader at Riverside Elementary. She was one of the town's kids, a familiar face on streets where children still rode their bikes alone, because Constantine was, until then, the kind of place people trusted to be safe. On the afternoon of November 8th, 2007, Jodi left a friend's house to ride her bike home. There was nothing unusual about that moment. No warning sign, just a child, a bicycle, and a short ride home she'd made hundreds of times before. A ride that, in a town like Constantine, no one had ever thought twice about. It was the last time she was seen alive. None of the people who saw her that afternoon knew they were witnessing the last ordinary moment of something much bigger. After that day, Constantine would no longer be the kind of place where children could ride their bikes home without anyone giving it a second thought. And that trust, that very foundation of small towns like this, would take far longer to fully shatter than anyone could have imagined at that time. A few hours later, her mother would call to report her missing. And before that night was over, Constantine would never be the same again. When night fell and Jodi still hadn't come home, her mother, Jo Gilson, called the police. Within the hour, dozens of neighbors had spread out across the town, flashlights sweeping through the brush, calling her name into the dark. In a town as small as Constantine, a search like that isn't just police work, it's the whole community's business. One of the people out searching that night was Ray Macan. He was 40 at the time, a former Constantine High School football player, later a coach, and then a referee for the town's youth league, and also an unpaid reserve police officer. Meaning he had basic law enforcement training, but wasn't a full-time professional officer. He had no criminal record. He had a wife, 2 kids. By all accounts from people who lived in town with him, he was the kind of man who'd be one of the first to show up when something went wrong. That night, he was one of them. He knew the area around town, the shortcuts, the hidden corners a panicked child or someone with bad intentions might take her to. Drawing on years as a reserve officer and his familiarity with the terrain where he'd grown up, he suggested to the search party, try the Constantine Township Cemetery, just a block from Jodi's house. It was Jo Gilson, Jodi's mother, who walked into that cemetery that night and found her daughter's body. Now, something needs to be said here clearly, because it will come back to haunt nearly everything that follows in this story. The man whose suggestion led to finding Jodi wasn't a stranger, wasn't someone with any reason to know where her body would be. He was just a neighbor trying to help, using exactly the kind of knowledge a neighbor like him would have. I remember everything about that day, one longtime Constantine resident said, the owner of a diner where Macan used to be a regular, recalled years later. It was the kind of day a small town never really forgets. That same night, the first rumors started spreading, faster than any official announcement from the police. Some people, incorrectly, believed Macan himself had found the body, not Jo Gilson. It was like, he's guilty, he found her, the diner owner recalled of the talk at the time. It was all so chaotic, you didn't know what to believe. It was the first seed of something that would grow for years afterward. The truth about who found Jodi and about the suggestion of where to look, gradually blurring together with suspicion about who had put her there. The next morning, the medical examiner confirmed what the family had feared all night. This was a homicide. Jodi had died of asphyxiation, and there was evidence she had been sexually assaulted. A town with 30 years free of murder now faced the worst question imaginable. Who had done this to an 11-year-old girl in their own community? The right answer wouldn't come for years, but the investigation would soon land on a name to focus on. And it wasn't the right one. In the early months, investigators collected evidence at the scene. By May 2008, police announced they'd found traces belonging to the killer at the scene, enough to rule out Jodi's family as suspects. But ruling out a few people isn't the same as finding out who did it. Over the next 3 years, the case became one of the most frightening kinds a small community can face. A death everyone remembers, and no one has an answer for. In 2011, 4 years after Jodi's death, Michigan State Police decided to bring the case back to the table. They set up an office right in Constantine, assigning a 4-person team full-time for the next 3.5 years, combing back through every page of the old file, every statement, every lead that had been overlooked. A full-time, dedicated investigative team running for more than 3 years for a town of fewer than 2,000 people. That's not typical for a cold case. It shows just how much pressure there was for an answer from Jodi's family and from a community living in a quiet, gnawing fear that whoever did this to Jodi was still out there somewhere. One resident who used to live near the Parrack house recalled, years later, a small detail that said a great deal. "You don't see many kids walking to school anymore," she said, "and our house is right on the way to the elementary school." That fear never really went away. It just quietly became a part of how the town operated. In 2012, DNA samples collected at the scene were sent to the state crime lab for testing. The list of persons of interest narrowed to fewer than 10 names. This is a detail worth underlining because it will matter a great deal as the story goes on. As early as 2012, science already had the tools to rule out the wrong suspects, but those tools weren't used to clear the man bearing the brunt of the investigation's pressure. This wasn't because investigators lacked the skill or the right tools. The problem was somewhere else. Once an investigation has staked most of its confidence in one name, reversing that confidence, admitting that years of suspicion may have been wrong from the start, is far harder than simply continuing down the road already chosen. Ray Macan, the man who'd suggested searching the cemetery 4 years earlier, became the focus of the new investigative team. Around Constantine, people started talking. There were a lot of accusations going back and forth, finger-pointing, one longtime resident recalled. A high school friend of Macan's, who later ran the town's youth football program, recalled that parents began coming to him, saying McCann shouldn't be around children anymore. With no other choice, he had to ask McCann to step down from coaching. They told us that they knew for a fact Ray did it. That friend recalled of what investigators told him and his wife. That they had everything but his DNA on her body. That they even thought he might have killed her right on the Rocket football field. He didn't believe it. I don't think he could hurt a kid, he said. That's not who he is. But a friend's belief wasn't enough to stand against what was happening inside the interrogation room to McCann. Over the following years, he was called in for questioning nearly 20 times. According to records later released by the Michigan Innocence Clinic, he denied involvement in Jodi's death 86 times in a row. 86 times! Somewhere in that process, an investigator told McCann, and according to his later civil lawsuit, his family as well, several very specific things. That his DNA had been found on Jodi's body. That there was physical evidence showing he was the one who'd placed the body in the cemetery. And that a security camera near a place called Tumble Dam, an old creamery site in town, had captured footage from that night. Now that footage, according to the investigator, showed McCann hadn't been where he claimed to have gone searching that night. None of it was true. No DNA sample from McCann was ever found on Jodi's body. No physical evidence ever showed he'd placed her body anywhere. And when lawyers later reviewed that same camera footage, they discovered something almost absurdly simple. The camera had never even been pointed towards the area where McCann said he'd parked. Physically, it could not have recorded what was used against him, because its angle never covered that spot to begin with. In the United States, police are legally allowed to lie to suspects about evidence during questioning. This isn't a loophole, it's a legal tactic upheld by the US Supreme Court decades ago in Frazier versus Cupp. It was designed with a specific purpose: to push a guilty person into contradicting their own story, under the pressure of believing science had already exposed them. But that tactic has a flaw no one in the interrogation room ever had to answer for. It can't tell the difference between a guilty person and someone telling the truth. Imagine sitting in a room again and again, hearing someone tell you science is against you, that there's DNA, there's video, there's physical evidence, while you know with absolute certainty that you didn't do it. Not once. Nearly 20 times, spread out over years, while the whole town you grew up in slowly decided you probably did it. This is exactly what sets this case apart from so many other wrongful conviction stories. The problem wasn't just that an investigator lied. The problem was that the lie was built on McCann's own kindness, suggesting the cemetery search. And that logic had no seam to break. If he denied it, that was a guilty man denying guilt. If he knew the town's geography too well, that was a guilty man exploiting that knowledge. There was no answer he could give to prove his innocence, because the frame of suspicion had been built so that any answer he gave, whatever it was, could be twisted into evidence against him. It was a closed loop, and a closed loop cannot break itself open from the inside. One detail makes the irony of this whole story even sharper. The man who actually killed Jodi Parrack was, at the time, living just one block from McCann's old house. No one knew that. No one looked there. In 2014, the St. Joseph County prosecutor charged McCann with perjury related to the murder investigation. The charge rested on a minor discrepancy between his testimony in court and what he told police 5 years earlier about the exact route he'd taken during that search that night. At the hearing, the lead investigator testified under oath that there was a video contradicting McCann's account, footage that, as we now know, couldn't have existed the way it was described. After spending 11 months in jail awaiting trial, facing the possibility of a life sentence, Macan came to believe he had no chance left of being acquitted. Not against what he thought was irrefutable scientific evidence in a community that had all but convinced itself he was Jodi's killer. So he accepted a deal, a no-contest plea to the perjury charge tied to his testimony about the Tumble Dam area. In 2015, he was sentenced to 20 months in prison. Throughout that entire time, DNA testing never once identified Macan as Jodi Parrack's killer. The only man ever jailed for Jodi Parrack's death, as of 2015, was a man never charged with killing her. And a man who had told the truth 86 times before being forced to accept a crime that someone else's lie had created. Meanwhile, less than 20 minutes from Constantine, another man was living a completely ordinary life. No one was looking for him. No one had any reason to suspect him. But that was about to change, for a reason that had nothing to do with Jodi Parrack. In August 2015, in White Pigeon, another small town not far from Constantine, a 10-year-old girl named Mackenzie Stafford was near her home when a neighbor, Daniel Furlong, then 65, asked her to help him with something in his garage. Inside, Furlong held her at knife point and tried to tie her up with an electrical cord. Mackenzie broke free and ran. She survived. That's all that needs to be said about that moment. Nothing more is needed for viewers to understand the severity of what she had went through. But her decision to run that night would be the one thing that broke 8 years of deadlock in the Jodi Parrack case, though no one, including Mackenzie herself, knew that yet. When police searched Furlong's home after the arrest, they found a list of names, girls living in the same mobile home community where he lived. According to the St. Joseph County prosecutor, this was a sign Mackenzie hadn't been his only intended target, because Furlong was now a suspect in an entirely separate assault. His DNA was entered into the system, standard procedure for any arrest involving violence. In September 2015, the lab confirmed it. Daniel Furlong's DNA matched 2 samples found on Jodi Parrack's clothing from 8 years earlier. The man who had never once appeared on a suspect list, a man who lived in Constantine and, according to the prosecutor, only knew the Parrack family in passing, was the one who had killed Jodi. Not a new technology, not a breakthrough from the very investigation that had spent all those years focused on Macan. For 8 years, Macan was questioned nearly 20 times by people convinced their logic couldn't be wrong. It took just one completely random event, unplanned, uncovered by no investigator's deliberate effort, to break through what 8 years of investigation couldn't. The case was cracked because another girl in another town ran fast enough to escape a garage. If Mackenzie hadn't gotten away that night, if Furlong had taken a different approach, a different area, made a smaller mistake, there was no guarantee he would have ever been caught. And no guarantee Ray Macan's perjury conviction would ever have been re-examined. The closed loop we just saw form in Constantine would be sitting there, untouched, unquestioned. Finding the right man, it turns out, doesn't mean everything gets fixed right away. In November 2015, Daniel Furlong pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in Jodi Parrack's death, in exchange for the prosecution dropping other charges, including felony murder, unlawful imprisonment, and second-degree criminal sexual conduct. In January 2016, he was sentenced to 30 to 60 years in prison. The judge noted that Furlong, then 65 and in poor health, would have to live up to 95 to even be eligible for parole, calling it nearly a miracle if he lived that long. In court, Valerie Jo Gilson, Jodi's mother, spoke. "For 8 years, I had to live every day not knowing who killed my child or why, she said. I had to prove my own innocence and that of several family members over and over for 8 years. She called Mackenzie a hero, the girl who actually caught the killer. And she asked a question that, in court, no one could answer to anyone's satisfaction. Whether the plea deal had really delivered justice for Mackenzie, when several charges directly tied to her had been dropped in exchange for Furlong's guilty plea. So she gets no justice at all, she asked. An investigator who was in the courtroom that day, someone who'd spent more than 3 years on the dedicated task force, told reporters after the hearing, "We're all going to carry this for the rest of our lives." It's hard not to take it personally, especially when you do this work every day for more than 3 years. For us, we'll never forget it. It's never going to leave us. With Furlong's sentence, the question of who killed Jodi Parrack was considered closed. But pause here for a moment, because this is where most accounts of this case tend to stop. The killer was caught. The sentence was handed down. For most people following the case through the news at this time, this was a complete ending. But another question remained, far less noticed, and for many in Constantine, nearly forgotten, in the relief of finally having an answer. Ray Macan, the only man ever jailed over this case, was still carrying a perjury conviction. A conviction built on evidence that, by now, even the investigating agency itself knew wasn't real. There was another thread, a shortened one, still hanging loose after this trial. After Furlong's arrest, police in Sturgis, a nearby town, began looking into whether he might be connected to the disappearance of Brittany Beers, a 6-year-old girl who vanished in 1997, about 16 miles away. As part of his plea deal, Furlong agreed to take a polygraph test about the case. Sturgis police later said they suspected he hadn't told the truth on that test. But suspicion isn't a conclusion. No formal charges were ever brought against Furlong in connection to Brittany Beers. This remains a question without an answer. And within the bounds of what's actually been confirmed, it should be left exactly that way. Unanswered. Not an answer we might invent in place of the investigative record. The Beers family, for years, lived with the same kind of uncertainty the Parrack family endured before 2015, except that as of this telling, they still haven't gotten the resolution of that the Parrack family eventually did. As for Ray Macan, what happens to a man convicted of a crime someone else's lie created, even after the real killer has been caught, has pleaded guilty, and has been sentenced? The Michigan Innocence Clinic, a legal organization at the University of Michigan dedicated to representing likely wrongful convictions, took on Macan's case. When their attorneys reviewed the entire file, they confirmed the detail mentioned at the start of this story. The security camera near the tumbled dam area, the one the investigator claimed showed evidence against Macan, had never been pointed towards the area where he said he'd parked. Physically, it could not have recorded what was used to convict him. A lie, it turns out, could be exposed by just checking the angle of the camera. But it took years and a legal organization from outside the very system that convicted him for anyone to actually do that. This may be the single most striking fact in this entire path to clearing his name. No agency that had ever investigated or prosecuted Macan was the one that uncovered the truth. It was outside lawyers and an organization built specifically to find wrongful convictions, not any self-examination from within the system that had convicted him. In December 2017, a Michigan Circuit Court judge officially vacated Macan's perjury conviction. St. Joseph County prosecutors John McDonough, the man who once prosecuted him, agreed with the decision. The Michigan Innocence Clinic director, David Moran, called it ironic. It's ironic that after sitting in a jail and being threatened with a life sentence, Ray Macan pleaded no contest to perjury, when in fact he had told the truth, and the charge itself was built on the police's own lies. Macan later filed a civil lawsuit against Sergeant Brian Fuller, the lead investigator on the case, alleging he had violated Macan's constitutional rights during the investigation. This is, at its core, the question that lawsuit put before a jury. Where is the line between a legal interrogation tactic, one that the law has allowed for decades, and evidence fabrication, severe enough to destroy years of an innocent man's life? The law allows police to lie about having evidence. The law says nothing about what happens when the lie is repeated nearly 20 times over several years against a man who never committed any crime. In September 2023, 16 years after Jodi Parrack's death, 6 years after Macan was exonerated, a federal jury ruled in his favor. $12.5 million in compensatory damages, plus $2 million in punitive damages. A total of $14.5 million. A month later, the two sides reached a final settlement. The Michigan State Police paid $11 million to close the case, $10 million to Macan, and $1 million in legal costs. Not $1 of it came from the investigation ever recognizing its own mistake. It came from a jury, years later, looking back at everything that happened with a lens the original investigation never had, appropriate skepticism. And it only happened because, before that, a girl in another town ran fast enough to escape a garage. The loop of suspicion around Ray Macan didn't break on its own. It could only be broken by the outside, by something no one in the investigation could have ever planned, predicted, or engineered. After the verdict, a reporter asked Macan whether he planned to move back to Constantine. He said he never would. There are too many bad memories there. He said it's too hard. In Constantine, people who once knew him say something different. He'd be welcome here, and I think people would welcome him too, said the diner owner where he used to be a regular. So much has happened, and given how it all turned out, I think he'd be welcome back. The friend who'd played high school football with him, the one who'd had to ask him to step down from coaching all those years ago, said the last time he saw Macan, after his release from prison, he was working as a janitor at a Walmart. I really wanted to reach out to him, he said, but I didn't want him to think I was just reaching out because he had a big settlement now. Knowing the truth, it turns out, isn't the same as getting a lost life back. And even after being fully exonerated, part of Macan's reputation remains out of reach. There are still people in Constantine, to this day, who say online that he was somehow involved, even though nothing supports that. This may be the hardest consequence of this whole story to fix. A conviction can be vacated by a judge. A settlement can be decided by a jury. But suspicion, once it spreads across a town where everyone knows everyone's name, doesn't disappear just because a legal document says it should. Somewhere in the 8 years between Macan's suggestion and Furlong's confession, the investigation had plenty of chances to ask itself again, did the evidence against this man actually exist? But no one did. It took a coincidence completely outside of anyone's control, a girl, a garage, an escape, for the truth to finally surface. This isn't a story about a system that failed completely, nor a story about a system that finally worked the way it should. It sits somewhere in between, and that's exactly what makes it worth remembering. Justice eventually came for both Jodi and Ray Macan, but by two entirely different paths, neither of which began with the very investigation that sent both of their stories in the wrong direction. But this story, even after a civil trial, a settlement, and a question about whether to return to a town, didn't begin with Ray Macan. And it shouldn't end with him. It began with an 11-year-old girl riding her bike home on a November afternoon and never arriving. Her body still lies in the very cemetery where a kind neighbor's suggestion led people to search for her. Where for 8 years afterward, the story surrounding that place focused on the wrong man, while the right one lived only a few streets away. Justice for Ray Macan in the end came. But the first justice, the justice this whole story owed from the very beginning, before any trial or settlement, always belonged to Jodi Parrack. If today's story is still in your mind, share your perspective down in the comments. If you appreciate well-researched cases told with respect for the truth, subscribe to Real Crime Stories to follow along with the next one. Thank you for watching. See you in the next story.